Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today's episode is going to be all about games that were released for Nintendo's 16-bit machine of dreams, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The SNES was the birthplace of many development companies and franchises that continue to thrive in the gaming market to this day. Without the opportunities development teams had with the SNES at the time of its release, it's likely that many of the series that gamers still know and love would have never existed, or at the very least, would have not been developed into what they are today. One hot title for the SNES that pushed one of Nintendo's franchises further than it had ever reached before was The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game's subtitle, A Link to the Past, is of course an incredibly clever nod to the game's plot and hero, Link, but this wasn't always going to be the final name for the game. During an interview with Electric Brain magazine back in 1992, Miyamoto provided insights into the game's development, sharing a few names that were juggled around the staff. Some of the titles even sounded like modern takes on Nintendo titles. To avoid the game sharing its name with the original NES Legend of Zelda, one idea was to call the game The New Legend of Zelda, a trend in naming habits that we wouldn't actually see until New Super Mario Bros. On the DS. Another title that was considered was Ganon Strikes Back, which was almost certainly a sly reference to Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. In this same interview, Miyamoto mentioned that the increased power offered by the Super Nintendo allowed their developers to increase the size of Link's adventure, and as a result, it was possible for them to include any leftover ideas they had from the original Legend of Zelda into the new title that the original NES simply couldn't handle. New concepts were considered, but dropped, as despite the Super Nintendo offering more memory, it still wouldn't be enough to fulfill every idea the team created. One such idea was to have fire spread on its own throughout the fields of grass found across Hyrule, a concept that wouldn't truly be implemented until Breath of the Wild, but which has also appeared in a limited fashion in what many consider to be a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, Four Swords Adventures. Another idea was to be able to use the shovel to dig into the ground, but rather than just uncover items, Link would have been able to dig out a canal and introduce it to a body of water to seep water into the man-made canal. Miyamoto also makes a brief mention when asked of any game similar to Zelda that they plan to release. He says, "How about Link's Adventure on the Super Famicom?" This was likely in reference to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a remake Nintendo was said to have been experimenting with using the Super FX chip. There's plenty more SNES games to talk about, but before we get to more trivia, we'd like to talk about today's sponsor, GameMaker. If you've ever wanted to get into game development but don't know how, GameMaker is an excellent place to start. We at DYKG actually used GameMaker when we were younger, and made all kinds of 2D demos and fan games. Take it from us, GameMaker has everything you need to bring your ideas from concept to completion without jumping between a ton of different software. Its drag-and-drop system lets you make games without writing a single line of code. But if you want to try something a bit more complex, there's a huge range of written and video tutorials to help you out. GameMaker's forum, Discord, and Reddit also have thousands of enthusiasts who support each other's endeavors and share their work. GameMaker also has the easiest to use cross-platform dev tech, letting you export your game directly to PS4, PS5, and both Xbox One and Series X. With no barriers to entry and some surprisingly powerful functionality, GameMaker helped bring games like Undertale and Hyper Light Drifter to life. If you want to join these developers in bringing your ideas to life, Did You Know Gaming viewers can download GameMaker Studio 2 using our link at the top of the description, or go to the URL on screen. And now, back to the trivia. Another franchise that came into its own during the era of the Super Nintendo was Shin Megami Tensei, the original series that would go on to spawn Persona. The third entry in the Megami Tensei series saw players finding themselves in Tokyo Destinyland, a pretty clear parody of Tokyo Disneyland. What the player didn't find, however, was two NPCs which wound up being cut from the game, though they can still be found within its data. These demons depict a mouse and duck wielding swords and a chainsaw respectively. These monsters were likely cut for looking almost exactly like Disney's Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Even though the intent was to parody the characters, which could be argued as fair use in a court of law, they may not have wanted to risk any legal action from Disney. That said, the two demonic parodies do appear in the PC Engine release of the game, though they've been reworked to distance themselves in appearance from their Super Famicom counterparts. Their names in the game are still a bit on the nose, being referred to as Zombie Mouse and Demon Duck. Speaking of game series with strong cult followings, Star Fox 2 is a pretty fascinating example of a cancelled game that had a continued presence throughout the years, with a post-console digital exclusive release from Nintendo. But some of the game's most interesting elements can't be seen without ripping off the hood and taking a peek at the innards. Argonaut Software did the bulk of the work on Star Fox 2, and were led at the time by Dylan Cuthbert. Cuthbert created many of the tools which were used to make the game, and he also took on the role of lead programmer. This would be pretty evident in the game's data, as it's possible to find a hidden credit within the game's files in the form of a 64-character wide ASCII art that spells out Cuthbert's full name. Another point of interest is a different line of unused text which reads Starglider 01 November 1991. This text is most likely a leftover from the prototype build of the original Star Fox. The early development version of Star Fox, which went under the name Starglider, leaked online in 2020, revealing an interesting stage of the game's creation. The prototype had no title screen or menus. In fact, it doesn't even feature any of the regular Star Fox crew in any form. All that is really available is a version of the game's map, which is pretty different from what would be featured in the final build, and an almost completely different version of the game's soundtrack, with more of an emphasis on a rock style of music. Of course, stages were also very dissimilar from what would be seen in the final game, and several smaller elements would be changed, like the player's R-Wing, which originally had extremely thin wings and a rear composed of just 3 polygons. But Star Fox wasn't the only Nintendo franchise that would experiment with 3D visuals. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is another top-tier game for the SNES, which was noteworthy for its graphics back in the day. The game has many secrets, and we've covered a few of them before, such as the title's regional differences. But since our video on the game a few years ago, many more Japan-only Easter eggs have come to light thanks to Clyde Mandelin's work over at Legends of Localization. The original Super Famicom release has quite a few sly nods to anime hidden within the thoughts of Mario's foe. Mallow, one of the characters that joins the player's party, has the ability to read the minds of enemies in battle, but their thoughts are different between regions. In the English game, the Terrapin enemy is pondering, "Yo, what's going on?" A basic translation that actually removes a reference to Dragon Ball. In the Japanese game, the enemy thinks, "Yo, I'm Nokohei. Are you watching, Grandpa?" With Nokohei being its Japanese name. This not only references the line, "Yo, I'm Goku," which plays at the end of every Dragon Ball episode in the Japanese dub, but the second half of the line alludes to Goku's grandpa, Gohan. The Crook enemy also references a very popular anime, but not in the English game. If the player scans their mind in the Western release, it'll say, "You can't run away, ha!" But the Japanese version says, "Mustn't run away, mustn't run away." This is a reference to Neon Genesis Evangelion's very first episode, where Shinji mutters to himself, "I mustn't run away," over and over again. Even Mario RPG's Hammer Brothers reference anime in their noggins. In the English game, they simply think, "I love my hammer." But in the Japanese game, their minds read, "My hammer tonight is a little bit different, turtle turtle." This is a nod to Lapan III's Goemon, who will say, "My Zantetsuken tonight is a little bit different." Zantetsuken, by the way, is a kind of sword that's either rumoured or believed to be able to cut through steel or iron. And we'll continue the trend of obscure references with this episode's random piece of trivia, where we'll be looking at Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The game features a huge number of secrets and Easter eggs, but one stands out to us as being particularly nice to see. Taking the form of an entire side quest, The Prodigy is an optional mission that, as a whole, pays tribute to the English electropunk band The Prodigy. The quest revolves around a bard, who is named and designed after Prodigy frontman Keith Flint. Keith is found in the Kingdom of Essex, the same county in which the real Flint was born. He explains that the Bishop of Ruins has condemned his music as being immoral, similar to the controversial response some people in the UK had to The Prodigy's music. Keith believes that the player's appearance is surely an omen, referencing the band's 2009 single, Omen. During the ensuing fistfight between the Bishop of Ruins and the player, Keith will sing the line, "Smack my bishop," a similar line from one of The Prodigy's biggest hits, the 1997 single, "Smack My Bitch Up." One of the game's writers, Kristen McGorry, confirmed the references were intentional on Twitter, stating that they were added as a tribute to Flint, who sadly passed away just a year before the game was released. Did you also know that Zelda: Link Between Worlds had some extensive censorship in the West? Or that Rockstar Games faced heavy backlash after revealing San Andreas' protagonist would be a black man? For more facts, check out our videos on Nintendo 3DS and PS2 games. Thank you for watching, and as a bit of a question for you all, what's the best kind of sandwich? Cheese? Ham? Cheese and ham? Bacon? Ooh, I could go for a bacon sandwich actually. Alright, I'm off. I'm gonna go get some bacon.